Good afternoon. My name is Randy Bernard, and I'm the acting United States Attorney for the Northern District of West Virginia. I want to introduce some of the individuals that are here representing the various agencies that were involved in this case. First of all, from the Department of Veterans Affairs, Inspector General Michael Missel, Assistant Inspector General for Investigations David Johnson, Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Investigations James Ross, Special Agent in charge of the Mid-Atlantic Field Office Kim Lampkins, Special Agent in charge of the Investigative Operations Division Colin Davis, Resident Agent in charge of the Washington Resident Agency Keith Vera. Also, representing the FBI is Acting Special Agent in charge Carlton Peoples, Assistant Special Agent in charge Scott Argiro, Acting Supervisory Special Agent Clayton Amsler, and Special Agent Ashley Archibald, who is one of the case agents in this case. From the West Virginia State Police is Corporal J.W. Smith, also one of the investigators in the case. And then finally, from the United States Attorney's Office, representing the team, the investigative and prosecutive team, are AUSA Jared Douglas and AUSA Brandon Flower. And I should say that from the Veterans Affairs, Department of Veterans Affairs, Colin Davis and Keith Arab were also case agents in this matter. Today, as you all know, the defendant Reta Mays, who was convicted of 7 counts of murder and 1 count of assault with intent to commit murder, was sentenced to consecutive life terms of imprisonment on the murder counts and 240 months consecutive for the assault with intent to commit murder. Now, in this case, we were presented with horrific crimes. If anybody listened to the sentencing, they heard the comments by the victims, by the prosecutor, AUSA Douglas, and by the judge. And the one thing I'll say, in a case like this, with crimes like this, justice is somewhat of an elusive concept. As prosecutors, we are aware that we, members of the Justice Department, as well as society, are judged by how we protect those most vulnerable among us. As I was saying, we are all judged by how we protect the most vulnerable among us, including our elders. In this case, the victims, as has been pointed out many times today, are part of a national treasure. They were veterans who, at least in part, entrusted their care to the defendant. They were there so that she could provide them aid and assistance and comfort, and instead, she coldly and callously murdered them. Now, as the judge has pointed out, the investigation in this case was exhaustive. The VA, OIG, the FBI, the West Virginia State Police, and all of the state and local agencies that investigated this case operate as a team. And I want to thank those agencies for what was one focused goal all along, and that was to bring this to a resolution to prove what we suspected, that crimes had occurred, that murders had occurred, and that the defendant committed those murders. The team in this case analyzed tens of thousands of medical records. They consulted with medical experts around the world to narrow hundreds of individuals that had access to the VA to narrow that down to a group and finally to a single person who had the opportunity to commit these crimes. They spent every day for a better part of a year investigating this case. And I know at times there was frustration because things couldn't be shared, but I can tell you that there was always an intent to see this case through as expeditiously as possible, but we weren't going to do anything unless we had the absolute right amount of evidence to charge the defendant and prove these crimes beyond a reasonable doubt. I want to start out by thanking, first of all, the families of the victims. They were very eloquent in their allocutions at and their witness statements. You heard the special place these individuals, the victims, had in their hearts. I want to thank the families because I know it was difficult when you're hurting and you want answers, and all as you're being told by the investigators is we have to protect the information and we will release that information as soon as possible. I'm sure it was frustrating, but I will tell you this right now, the families acted with respect towards the investigators and towards our team, and were very patient, and I want to thank them because they don't know how much that meant to the investigators who obviously were investigating this case with a passion and were personally invested in a case like this as anyone would be. So I commend the families and again thank them. Now, as we said at the last press conference, there were certain objectives, significant considerations in pursuing a plea and an expeditious result to this case. First of all, the victim families had to be on board with any plea, and they made it known that no plea would be sufficient in their mind unless there was life imprisonment imposed. But it was also important for them that there be an expeditious and speedy resolution to the case. Second, any plea had to encompass and account for any of the crimes for which we would otherwise charge the defendant through an indictment. And then finally, the investigative team itself and prosecutive team also believed that no plea made sense unless we could obtain consecutive life imprisonments for each murder count and the maximum for the assault account. As I indicated earlier, justice may be an elusive concept, but the sentences handed down today met the objectives that was part of our objective from the beginning. Now, as I stand here today, as we all stand here today, we're only a few weeks away from Memorial Day, in which we honor those veterans who sacrificed their lives for all of us. I think it's also appropriate today that we do recognize and honor the victims in this case, the veterans. And I want to take some time, and I ask for your patience while I talk about some of these individuals, because I do believe at every opportunity today we should honor them. Robert Edge Sr. Mr. Edge was 82 years old at the time of the offense. He and his three brothers were military veterans of the United States Navy. He joined the Navy after graduating from high school in 1952 and was previously stationed in Oklahoma and California before finishing at the Naval Station in Norfolk, Virginia in 1956 with an honorable discharge. After his military service ended, he worked for Westinghouse in Fairmont, West Virginia for 36 years. He was married for almost 65 years. His wife preceded him in death by about 5 months, but he and his wife had 2 children, 9 grandchildren, 9 great-grandchildren, to whom, as you heard, he was a hero. Robert Kozil. Mr. Kozil was 89 years old at the time of the offense. He was a Korean War-era veteran. From 1951 to 1953, he served in the United States Army in the 11th Airborne as a parachutist in Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Mr. Kozil was married, and he and his wife had 2 children. He was known, as you've heard, as Pappy, and he was a man who reportedly would give you the shirt off his back. Archie Edgell. Mr. Edgell was 84 years old at the time of the offense. He served in the United States Army from 1953 to 1955. He was a Korean War-era veteran. He served in Germany in the Army and was part of the Army band, the Ivy Troubadours. He was married for 63 years and had 5 children. He and his wife also cared for 5 additional children at a point in their lives after those children's mother had passed away with cancer and the father was overwhelmed. So that tells you what kind of people the Edgells are. George Shaw. Mr. Shaw was 81 years old at the time of the offense. He served the United States Air Force with distinction for 28 years. He was a Korean and Vietnam War era veteran. He was highly decorated. He received recognition for his extensive service in underground Italy and underground Germany. He was married and had 2 daughters, one of whom is also a veteran. He is also survived by his spouse Norma, with whom he spent 59 years and shared a number of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The person we've identified as W.A.H. was 96 years old at the time of the offense. He was a veteran of World War II, part of the Rome-Arno campaign. He served as a member of the United States Army from 1942 to 1945. In fact, he had joined the Army prior to his 18th birthday, so his father actually had to sign the papers for him to serve. During his service, he was recognized with various awards and honors. In fact, after his service, when he was a postal worker, he saved a woman. Scam artists were trying to empty her bank account, and he intervened and kept that from happening. He was married for 70 years and has 2 surviving daughters. Felix McDermott was 82 years old at the time of the offense. He served the United States Army, including active duty from 1962 to 1968. He was a Vietnam War era veteran and received various honors and medals. He retired from the Pennsylvania National Guard and, all told, served over 20 years in the military. After the military service, he was a truck driver. He was married and had 2 daughters and a son, the latter of whom is also a veteran. Raymond Golden was 88 years old at the time of the offense. He was a Korean War and Vietnam War era veteran. He served in the United States Army from 1951 to 1953. He served in the United States Air Force from 1955 to 1973. He was a loadmaster and served in Vietnam, Panama, and the Philippines. After completing his military service, he worked as a United States postal worker. He was married and had 2 children, a son and a daughter. He too is survived by a spouse who you heard from in the courtroom today. Russell R. Posey. Mr. Posey was 92 years old at the time of the offense. He is a decorated World War II veteran. He served in the United States Navy from 1943 to 1946. After his service, he attended WVU on the GI Bill and received a degree in agriculture. He worked with his father in a lumber business, but he also owned 2 businesses himself. He and his wife operated the Dairy Delight in Elkins and Posey's Lawn and Garden. He was known throughout the community as Big Russ and was endeared. Mr. Posey was married and had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. And I think it goes without saying, everything you've heard in the courtroom from the victims' families, you heard the judge's comments, and from the bios that I just summarized, goes without saying that these men were heroes. They deserve all of our respect and honor. And I hope today, although, as I said, and as the judge indicated, with a sentence, it's always tough to make up for or to recompense the families for what they've lost, but I hope today that these sentences do provide the respect and honor that these men deserve. Finally, I want to again thank the investigators from the VA, OIG, the FBI, the West Virginia State Police, and all of the local, state, and federal officers and agents that were involved in this case. There were many, and I can't go through each and every name, but I will in particular recognize some of the individuals that were involved from the start, and that would be SAC Colin Davis and RAC Keith Vereb of the VA OIG, Special Agent Ashley Archibald, who is the case agent from the FBI, Corporal J.W. Smith of the West Virginia State Police. Thank them all for their tireless dedication. I want to thank former U.S. Attorney Bill Powell, who is in attendance today. This case was a priority for Bill. I know because we've talked. He holds veterans very dear to his heart. And this case was a priority for him. He was personally involved in the investigation and the prosecution, so I want to thank Bill for all his efforts and the momentum that he created to get this case to an expeditious resolution so that we could be here today. I want to thank members of the United States Attorney's Office. Everybody was involved, from our support staff, our attorneys. The entire office worked as a team because, again, this was a case for which we all had a passion. I want to specifically recognize AUSA Jared Douglas and Brandon Flower, the co-counsel in this case. And with respect to Jared, he was the lead prosecutor, and he was asked to lead this team and was given a specific directive to get this case to a resolution and indict it with what was, at the time, was a very aggressive schedule. And I think he performed, and they all performed in an outstanding manner to be, again, at a point in a resolution where we are. I would also be remiss if I didn't thank Chris Frizzell, our victim witness coordinator at the United States Attorney's Office. She spent many hours and logged in many miles meeting with family members along this journey. I know the family members are very appreciative of her because I've heard the comments, and that they now know why I consider, and I think others consider her, one of the best victim witness coordinators in the country, not just in our office. And finally, I want to thank Stacy Bishop, our public affairs specialist, for coordinating all the press in this case, all of the fielding the requests and responses, and coordinating these press conferences. I'm very thankful, and but for her efforts, we would not be able to communicate the message that we have been setting forth. With that, and prior to taking any questions, we do have a few other speakers, and first I want to call to the podium the Inspector General for the VA, Office of Inspector General, Michael Missel.
Thank you, Randy. Good afternoon. The Office of Inspector General conducts independent oversight of VA. With respect to the criminal investigation, we were on site within 24 hours of being notified of a possible problem. Very shortly thereafter, through the great work of our agents, we were able to persuade VA to take Ms. Mays off of patient service. That act alone likely saved lives. The agents continue to doggedly pursue every lead in this case, which resulted in the sentencing that we had today. But for their efforts, along with the U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI, and our other law enforcement partners, we would not be standing here today. So that answered who did it. The next question is, how could something like this happen? So our Office of Healthcare Inspectors, which consists of physicians, nurses, and other providers, conducted a healthcare inspection to determine the environment of care, the controls, and what actually occurred during the time. So we completed that inspection, and we are publishing our report today. Our report found serious, pervasive, and deep-rooted clinical and administrative deficiencies at the medical center. It was a series of missed opportunities that contributed to the criminal actions occurring, not being stopped, and for allowing it to go on for as long as they did. So let me go through some of the more significant ones that are detailed in our report. First, there was a failure to review Ms. May's prior employment. Prior to coming to VA, she was employed at the North Central Regional Jail. Had VA, as required, gone back and looked at that employment, they would have realized there was allegations of excessive use of force against her. The question is, somebody with those kind of allegations, should they be involved in patient care? So that was one missed opportunity where they could have not hired her in the first place. There's a second opportunity with respect to her background. She actually received a Secretary's Award for Excellence in 2017. As part of receiving that award, they were required to go back to make sure that her background check had been done. They checked it had when it actually hadn't. So there's yet another missed opportunity where if they'd looked at it, they could have identified the issue. The second broad area is with respect to the security of the medication room and the medication carts. There was insulin in both of those. So everybody on Ward 3A, where Ms. Mays worked, had full access to the medication room and the medication cart. This was a violation of policy, as they should have been secured. With respect to the medication room, to bring people back from severe hypoglycemic events, there's a medication, a rescue medication referred to as D50. As there was one event after another, the use of D50 was very extensive on the ward. Again, nobody realized it was happening. They should have had this in their inventory. It should have popped up automatically, but somebody should have communicated, why are we using so much D50? Hypoglycemia is very rare in patients who do not take diabetic medicines, so somebody should have been asking a question. They didn't do so in that situation. Another missed opportunity. With respect to the physicians, the hospitalists, and the other providers, including the nurses, with respect to the providers, no diagnostic testing was ordered for 7 of the 8 patients who were included in the plea agreement. Again, hypoglycemia, particularly unexplained hypoglycemia, is very rare. They should have ordered some kind of diagnostic test to get to the bottom of what happened there. With respect to the one patient where they did order the test, they actually ordered the wrong test, and had it been applied, the correct test, it was after D50 had been applied, so it wouldn't have shown what it could have. Next area, the failure of the hospitalists, the doctors, and the nurses to communicate effectively about patient care. To have really high quality of care, you need to coordinate. You need to have coordination of efforts there. So as these events are occurring, they're not talking to one another about how can this happen? Why is it on this ward, and why are we having such a rare event? It's particularly striking because in the spring of 2018, you had 4 unexplained hypoglycemic events within 3 weeks. That should have set off major alarm bells. Somebody should be asking the question and looking into it. They did not do so. Next is patient safety. These events, an unexplained hypoglycemic event, is a patient safety event. It should have been reported to the patient safety department. None of them ever were. Next, why wasn't it reported? Because the patient safety manager never trained the staff about what kind of events should be reported. Again, that's a major failing of the medical center. You put in place systems to help prevent things like this, and it just wasn't done. Finally, the risk manager had tools at their disposal, including a mortality tracker that could have shown any spikes in mortality at the medical center. During Ms. May's time there were 9 different times when there were mortality spikes. Nobody bothered to check. Nobody picked it up. Our report contains 15 recommendations, each of which VA has concurred to assess and address the issues that we identified in the report. One of these recommendations is for VA to take another look at the various patients that had quality of care issues outside of the hypoglycemic events. So we are going to be monitoring this very closely. Our work is continuing, and we are going to ensure that VA fully implements all 15 of those recommendations. Nothing will bring back the veterans who are lost. Hopefully, the sentencing today and our healthcare inspection report will bring solace to the families and hopefully ensure that nothing as tragic as this ever happens again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Missel. Next, speaking on behalf of the FBI, is the acting special agent in charge, Carlton Peoples.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am proud to stand here with all our partners who helped make this day possible. I know this has been a long, tough road for the families of these veterans. To those families, I want to say thank you for your patience and trust in us to do a thorough investigation. Your loved ones deserved better. After everything they sacrificed for our country, there is an increased expectation that our veterans get good medical care. You put your trust in a woman who decided she could pick and choose your loved one's fate. The injustice of this motivated our investigators and prosecutors, and we are thankful that it was acknowledged today in court. There is no explanation or justification for what Reta Mays did. Nothing can bring back what was taken from you, but we hope that the sentence delivered today will bring you peace and closure. Every day, the FBI and our partners work to ensure those who commit heinous crimes such as this are held accountable. Today, Reta Mays was held accountable. These deaths gripped Clarksburg. We understood how important it was to the community and the veterans' families and worked diligently to build this case. I want to thank the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Veterans Administration, OIG, for their partnership. This was a team effort and an integral part of doing a full and complete investigation to make sure justice was served. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Finally, I've asked Jared Douglas to say a few words on behalf of the prosecution team.
First, I just want to say thank you to the families. It has been and will undoubtedly be and continue to be the privilege of my career to have represented them and their loved ones in this case. Mr. Bernard has asked me to speak a little bit to the investigation. First, I will say that I've never worked with such invested and dedicated investigators in my career. As far as the investigation, it is simplest to think about the evidence in two categories. First, medical expert opinion. What caused the deaths? And two, attribution. Who caused the deaths? With regard to medical expert opinion, we consulted with an endocrinologist who is a specialist on diabetes, of course a pathologist who conducts the autopsies, and then what's called a pharmacokineticist, which is someone who studies the effect of medication on the body. The endocrinologist determined that insulin was the only plausible cause of the patient's hypoglycemia. This opinion was based on a review of the pathologist's report and patient's medical records, including the record of blood sugar levels and the record of administration of dextrose 50. The endocrinologist, however, was disadvantaged because the medical providers had not performed the usual diagnostics to determine whether insulin was involved. For example, there was no blood test to look at to say, oh, there's that marker that insulin was involved. So therefore, she had to back her way into insulin being the cause. She had to rule out all the other types of things that could cause the hypoglycemic conditions, because we were dealing, obviously, with patients who had comorbidities. The pathologist then determined that the insulin was the cause of death. That was based on an autopsy, toxicology, and of course the endocrinologist's opinion. The pathologist used a test to discover these insulin injection sites called immunohistochemistry staining. And during 5 of the autopsies, that staining process discovered the presence of insulin in these injection sites. Though it should be noted that this type of test had never in the world, not in West Virginia, not in the United States, in the world, been done so far post-mortem. Before this case, the longest it had been done reliably post-mortem was 2 or 3 weeks. In this case, we were dealing with those who have already been buried for months. The pharmacokineticist, which we went to Wales to get, the country of Wales, to get a pharmacokineticist who had studied insulin for 30 years. He was able to not only corroborate the cause of hypoglycemia, but was able to provide an estimated window of time during which the patient received the unprescribed insulin, often to a number of hours. Now, regarding the attribution evidence, first I'll say what there wasn't any evidence of. There was no relevant surveillance video. There was no eyewitness who observed Mays give a patient insulin. There was no tracking of insulin to find any missing insulin. There was no murder weapon. There were no fingerprints. There was no confession. A confession was sought, including through 3 separate law enforcement interviews, but never obtained. So again, the investigators were forced to back their way into who this could be. The investigators reviewed all employees at that hospital's HR records. We're talking 1,200 employees. And that review revealed that only 4 employees had worked during all of the subject night shifts, including Reta Mays, who was the only Ward 3A employee on every night shift. The investigators then obviously had to rule out the other 3 people. They reviewed card swipe, identification card swipe records, as well as computer access records to place the other 3 employees elsewhere in the hospital during the administration window that had been identified by the pharmacokineticist. Of course, there was an extensive review of the medical records. That revealed that Mays was the documented one-on-one sitter during the administration window for Edge, Kozil, Shaw, and Golden. Progress notes also document Mays' contact with Posey during his administration window. You heard me mention 5. There are 8. So for the other 3, there was no documented contact. We had to rely on investigation as far as interviews, which went over 300 interviews. And then there was, of course, electronic evidence, including Facebook messages with a colleague and recorded calls with her incarcerated husband, which you heard me discuss during the plea hearing. Thank you.
Thanks, Jared. At this time, we'll open it up for any questions you might have for any of the members of the panel.
There are other suspicious deaths at the VA. Any indication that she was involved in them?
What I will say is any deaths for which we could prove that Reta Mays was involved, had committed any crimes or murders, we've charged. As you know, and I think others know, there are civil litigation, civil suits being pursued, and as the Inspector General indicated, there's going to be an entire review of patient files or the patients that had unexplained or certain conditions during that time. There was already one review, but with respect to the crimes, any murders, no, there's no other evidence at this time that she was involved.
I had a little bit of trouble hearing her this morning, but were there comments made during the interviews where she said these were mercy killings, or is that just a contention possibility that was raised by the defense?
That was primarily raised by the defense, that mercy or that she was trying to provide comfort measures, but as you've heard, that's just absurd.
So we really don't know why.
I think as the judge indicated, we'll never know exactly why. We'll know some of the reasons she's given, but as I think the court eloquently addressed all of those, it's just simply unbelievable to think that there was any compassion involved with any of these murders.
Mr. Douglas just mentioned a moment ago that there was multiple efforts to get a confession out of her. When the judge, before he rendered his sentence, had said that she had basically come off the street and eventually confessed. I want to make sure I'm totally understanding about how he got to the point of the guilty plea after so many years.
Yeah, I'll let Jared, I know that he was involved in the interview, so go ahead and answer.
So there were 3 law enforcement interviews from July of 18 to October of 19, right? And so, and we're talking not just, we have a few questions for you, but the last one was 6 hours long, and she did not confess, okay? So when the judge is referring to her, I think he said it was unique that she came in, okay? That's only because we then got her attorneys appointed after the investigation had been completed through a target letter process. She was appointed attorneys. We then present to those attorneys, look, here's what the evidence we have, and we can either reach a plea to an information or she's going to be indicted. Which one are you going to choose? And so part of that process is not her coming in and saying, yes, I confess, confess, confess. That's not what happens. She goes in, literally she goes in and pleads. We haven't talked to her other than those 3 law enforcement interviews. She goes in and pleads, and then pursuant to the plea agreement, we debrief her because she is required in the plea agreement to talk to us. Now, we're not really allowed to talk about that with the judge because it's not to be used against her under the plea agreement. But that's where I was able to ask her questions that were provided to me by the investigators, and she answered all those questions.
Did she give conflicting information in the previous interviews prior to the debrief?
So in none of those interviews did she admit any involvement. So all of it is contradictory by now it's saying that she was involved, it was her.
Well, let me, again, I'll bring the IG because I think he can address what actions, any further actions that are going to be taken. I know he mentioned some with respect to the patients, but Mr. Missel, did you hear the question?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? So we do not take any action against VA employees. We're the independent oversight. VA is responsible for doing that. They have taken some actions with respect to employees at the medical center. We published our report today, and it remains to be seen whether they'll take any additional action as a result. But we do have recommendations that they need to implement.
Is there any reason to believe that these are problems beyond just this one particular VA, that they may exist at other VAs?
We haven't looked at the other VA facilities with respect to these specific problems. Our hope is that all VA facility directors read our report and ensure that they don't have any similar issues at their facility.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks. Oh, yes, sir.
Not really a question. I just want to say thank you to all of you.
Oh, you're welcome. We appreciate. All right. I knew you would thank Chris, but thank you very much. We appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for coming.